If you look at wheat, for example, and wheat's kind of got a bad rap now, and as a wheat farmer, I take quite exception to that because this is the grain that built ancient civilizations for thousands of years. The Phoenicians, the Romans, the Greeks, the Egyptians, all these people had a diet based on wheat. Was it the fall of their civilization because they were eating wheat? I don't think so. And were 20% of their people unable to eat wheat without trouble? I don't think so. Right now, 20% of our population cannot eat wheat without having some kind of difficulty. So rather than throw the baby out with the bathwater, let's go back and look at the baby and see what's changed. All the dirt the baby has now, let's wash that off. Let's go back to heritage wheats. Let's go back to organic farming techniques without all these chemicals.
From the Weston A. Price Foundation, welcome to the Wise Traditions Podcast for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
Hey everybody, I'm your host Hilda Labrador. This is episode 210 and our guest today is Bob Quinn. Bob is a farmer and a leader in organic and sustainable agriculture. He is the author of Grain by Grain, a quest to revive ancient wheat, rural jobs, and healthy food. Today, Bob talks to us about an ancient Egyptian wheat which he learned about as a young boy. He was told it originated from King Tut's tomb, and that handful of grains changed his life. The wheat was Khorasan, and Bob and his family began to explore its properties and uniqueness, and it definitely set the course for his future. So many people today have wheat sensitivities and intolerances that we need to look at other options. You may suspect that you have gluten intolerance, or you may be one of those people that avoids wheat altogether. Bob suggests that we re-examine our relationship to wheat in today's podcast. We should look at the kind of wheat that we're eating, and while we're at it, take a closer look at our entire food system and its impact on our health. With common sense and compassion, Bob sheds light on our choices and helps us to reconsider our priorities. Before we dive into the content, let's take a moment and thank our sponsors, Ancestral Supplements with Grass-Fed Colostrum. Colostrum is mother's first milk, fundamental nourishment that provides all of the essentials to thrive as a healthy animal in nature. It is loaded with immune and growth factors and protective proteins. Go to ancestralsupplements.com and order yours today. You'll find a range of products there made from New Zealand-sourced, nose-to-tail organ meats, bone marrow, and colostrum in simple, convenient gelatin capsules. Ancestral Supplements, putting back in what the modern world has left out. And a reminder that our Wise Traditions Conference is right around the corner, November 15th to the 17th, just north of Dallas, Texas. Do whatever you can to make it. It is a gathering like no other. It nourishes you in every way. The Wise Traditions Conference is where ancestral wisdom meets modern science. Register today at wisetraditions.org. This is Holistic Hilda, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Bob.
Well, thank you very much, Hilda. It's great to be here.
I'm so glad you're here. I was blown away by the way you are reviving rural jobs. You're fighting for a new food system and reviving ancient wheat. It's exciting.
It really has been a great trip. I am thrilled to death to be here and to be have a chance to have written about it.
So tell me, when was the moment that you were realizing something's wrong with our food system, something's got to change? What was that aha moment for you?
Well, I think the first time that happened was almost 50 years ago. I was a graduate student in UC Davis, and we were out in the country on a field trip. And we had stopped at a peach orchard, and I love peaches. I love the aroma, I love the flavor, and I love everything about them. And I was used to eating good ones, even though we never could eat them off the tree. When we moved to California, we could, and that was a fantastic experience when they were actually dead ripe. And we'd go out in the orchard, and the farmer would say, well, do you plan to can today or tomorrow? And based on what we told him, he said, go to this pile or that pile. And they were just as luscious.
The kind of peaches that, like, when you bite into them, the juice drips down your face, right? Like the way peaches are supposed to be.
That's right. It's heavenly. So that's what I was kind of anticipating, because we were told they were picking peaches at this peach orchard. So I thought, well, certainly they'd share at least one among, a few of the students. But when I got there and we walked down the peach orchard, I couldn't smell the aroma of ripe peaches. And although the peaches looked beautiful, kind of the blush of red and, the different colors that you recognize as a ripe peach, when they gave us one, they were hard as a rock. And when I bit into it, it was actually green. There was no flavor. It was terrible. And they were picking them green so they could ship them in bulk, clear across the country without being bruised. And what they have done to figure out how to do that was to spray some type of petroleum spray on these peach trees so that the peaches then turn this beautiful color of ripeness that you expect. But underneath, it was all a facade. Underneath was still a green peach. And I thought that was deceptive. I was disappointed, and I thought, wow, is this the way modern agriculture is going? And I didn't rebel right at that moment, but it was really the first time that I started to question what we were doing and all the technology and all the great advancements in agriculture. What really was it doing to our food?
That's a great question. It sounds like they almost spray painted those peaches. You know what I mean? Like they looked one way, but they were a different way on the inside.
Yes, it was really a facade that allowed people, that drew people in to buy them at the grocery store. And unsuspecting buyers would get home with those, and I'm sure they weren't very happy. But they got across the country without a bruise. And so it's all about cosmetics. The more I started studying this and understanding how much cosmetics and looks are so important, even above taste and aromas and flavors and all that stuff, I thought that this is really ridiculous. I used to tell my friends, if you really want a strawberry that looks that beautiful and gorgeous and gigantic and yet doesn't have any flavor, I said, why don't you just buy a picture, put that on your wall, and then buy a smaller strawberry in the farmer's market or somewhere out of your own garden that really tastes good. And we don't have to be so hung up in looks and cosmetics and that sort of thing. I mean, we have the same problem with how people are dressing and all the money they spend. It's a facade. It's really not what's most important. What's most important is what's inside. And food is no different than people in that regard.
Wow, that's a profound thought, and I love it. Our world needs to hear that today. So now talk to us how you went from that moment in that peach orchard to becoming a farmer of this ancient grain. And can you tell us more about it? Is it pronounced kamut?
It is, kamut, K-A-M-U-T, and that is a long story, and so that's the reason we wrote a book to really have time to explain it, but in a nutshell, I was at a county fair when I was in high school, and this old fellow, he's probably younger than I am now, but he looked pretty old to me then, and he motioned me over and he says, "Hey, Sonny," he said, "would you like some of King Tut's wheat?" And I said, "Oh, well, yeah, that'd be interesting," and he poured this giant grain into my hand, just a little handful. The legend was that a farmer from our county had a son in the Air Force stationed in Portugal. He went to a bar one night, and the fellow sitting next to him had just gotten back from Egypt on furlough, and they were talking, and he said, "Look at here, what I got out of this tomb in Egypt." And he showed him this wheat, and of course this guy from Montana was a farmer's son, and he was very interested. And he said, "Wow, think I could send some of that to my dad and see if it'd grow?" And he said, so they did. And I was able to send 30 or 40 kernels back to Montana, and this is about 1950. And it grew, which would have been the first clue, actually, that it didn't come out of a tomb, because grain doesn't last that long. It doesn't last for 1,000 years and not lose its germination. So he probably got it in the Cairo Bazaar or something, but that was the story that came with it. And so it was grown in Montana for a few years, and this guy got it up to 300 or 400 bushel, and it was just a big novelty. I mean, this is the grain that came out of King Tut's tomb, and it was giant wheat, and it grew very tall, and that's all anybody knew about it. The bread makers couldn't really make the American style of bread with it. They weren't very interested. He couldn't find anybody who was very interested in it, so he ended up feeding it to the pigs. But in the meanwhile, several in the community started growing little patches and handing it out as a novelty, and that's where I first saw it. When I got to college, Davis, then about 14 years later, I was eating a package of corn nuts one day, and it said, "Corn nuts made with a giant corn." And I thought, wow, I wonder if they'd be interested in giant wheat. And I called up my dad and I said, hey, Dad, I said, see if we can find some of that old King Tut's wheat. And I got an idea. And so he found a pint jar, less than a pound, in one of his friend's basements. He sent me a few tablespoons. I sent the corn nuts. And they said, this makes the most fantastic snack we've ever had. They said, we'll take 10,000 pounds. And I said, oh, well, I don't really have 10,000 pounds. But if you'll give me a couple of years, I'll have everything you want. I called my dad. I said, Dad, plant all that right in the garden right now. And so we planted in the garden, and we planted in California in the winter and Montana in the summer. In 2 or 3 years, we had 50 pounds from our handful. And then I called up corn nuts, and the guy I had talked to was gone. No one knew anything about it, and they weren't interested in it anymore.
Oh, no.
So that went back to the storage shed and just sat on a shelf for a few years. And then in 86, so this is about 77, we first discovered this. And then the corn nuts thing was over by about 1980. In 86, we went to our first health food show in California, in Anaheim. And my dad and Mom went with me to help me with it. I had a small business then selling stone ground whole wheat flour from grain that we grew on our farm, just regular winter wheat and spring wheat, high protein to make great bread. My dad took a small jar of this grain and showed it to everybody, and thousands of people went by our booth. My cousin and I were working on the bread and the flour business, and the wheat business had our pockets stuffed full of business cards and referrals after 3 days, and my dad had one, and he was thrilled. So we went home and we pulled that, because of that one interest, we pulled the grain out of the shed and we planted it all, and then we started passing out samples because it had a great flavor. And we had it made into a pasta. And so we're passing that out, and my dad gave it to a lady nearby that couldn't eat wheat. And she was just deathly sick of wheat and many other foods and other environmental problems like formaldehyde in the carpet. She couldn't go into a new house or anything like that. And I said, Dad, you shouldn't be giving her that wheat. And he said, well, it's organic, isn't it? Because we were starting to do organic by that time. So that was a whole other story. But we were. And she called up the next day and she says, what is this stuff? She said, because she had done kinesiology, muscle testing, and so she felt she could try it. But when she tried it, not only could she eat it, but she called up my dad. She said, what is this stuff? She said, it makes me feel better. I said, wow, well, we'll give you some more. And she said, do you think you could give some to my sister? Because she can't eat wheat either. And we gave it to her, and she had many food sensitivities that she had to avoid. And after she'd eaten this grain for 3 or 4 weeks, or maybe a month or so, she was not only could eat it, it made her feel better also, but she was less sensitive to other foods. And this opened up a whole new vista for me, which I'd never thought of before, and set us on a trail of research and promotion and study that now is 30 years old.
That's fantastic and so important, because nowadays a lot of people have food sensitivities and feel like they can't tolerate wheat. And so this is something that they might want to know more about.
That's our hope, because what it's done for me is really open up a whole new door, as I said, on a vista that I had no idea about. And now, with wheat was a perfect one to start with, because there's so much problem with it, because it's been changed so much. And it's not just gluten. People blame it, oh yeah, it's gluten, I'm going to be wheat-free, gluten-free. It's not just gluten. There's 4 main things that we tell people. If you're wheat sensitive, now this is not celiac, because they're really another level of seriousness that we don't delve with. But if you're sensitive to the point that you have bloating or cramps or other things that disabilitate you when you eat wheat, then just try to get wheat that's organic, for one thing, because we've changed the way we grow it. That affects the nutrition of it and also how it affects the body. So get organic. And then we've changed how we bake with it. And the modern bakers are using fast-rising yeast, which means that the bread is made so fast that it has no time to pre-digest that gluten and other large molecules within the flour and the grain. And if you compare that to slow fermentations like sourdough, we know from research that 48 hours of slow fermentation will destroy 97% of all the gluten in the bread. So if people have a gluten sensitivity, if gluten is their problem, and for some people it is, by having slow fermentations, you destroy 97%, you're probably going to improve your chances tremendously that you can eat this stuff. The other thing is to avoid modern wheat because of the changes they made in their breeding programs, not only to make it higher yielding, shorter and more disease resistant and all this stuff for the farmers, better able to respond to high levels of chemical fertilizer and that sort of thing. But they've also made the gluten a much more complex and bigger molecule so that it can hold more air. so that the air bubbles that form with the gluten dough around the gas as the bread rises, as it ferments and produces carbon dioxide, it makes bubbles in the dough and causes the bread to rise. And the more it rises, the more bread you've got for less wheat. And the bakers are very happy about this. And so they're wanting to drive the plant breeders to make better and better loaf volumes, which means they had to change the gluten to do that. That created a problem with some people who couldn't digest it anymore, because now it's not the same gluten as they started with. So if you would go back and make sure you're eating heirloom grains that are older than, say, 80 years, pre-World War II, that there wasn't much of that before World War II. Also, you should eat whole grain. The industrialization of wheat that we've done that really detracts from its nutrition now is to make white flour. And we throw away almost a third of the nutrition, which is often fed to the pigs. They're eating better than we are.
Yes.
So eat whole grain, eat organic, eat ancient grains or heritage wheats, and eat sourdough. And if you do those four things, you'll probably decrease your sensitivities, if it's a true wheat sensitivity, by 90% or so.
Wow, that's fantastic. And when you were describing that process to make the loaves larger, it reminded me of how people in conventional feeding operations will try to fatten a cow and get them to market sooner. I was like, wow, the bottom line is money for some of these producers, isn't it?
It's all about money. It's all about efficiency. It's all about making cheap food. And so what I try to explain in this book and everywhere I get a chance to talk is that there's a very high cost for cheap food. And you don't pay it at the checkout counter. This is the fallacy. You think, oh man, I can get a whole basket for whatever it is, and it's cheap. We are spending less than 10% of our disposable income on food. It used to be 20%. So what are we doing with all that extra money? Are we buying new boats or bigger houses? No, we're spending it on health care, on more pills. And now it's just reversed. 50, 60 years ago, we're spending 8% of our income on health care and medicines and pills, and now it's close to 20%. And food went from close to 20 down to less than 10. So they just switched places. And they're very, very closely related. The cheap food that we're eating now is lower in nutrition, and much of it is helping to make us more sick, particularly with chronic disease.
Yeah, I see it more and more with young people with arthritis and things like that. And I'm like, how do you have arthritis when you're in your 20s or some autoimmune condition? So maybe it's that they're actually not feeding themselves with the most nutrient-dense food, including grains. What do you think of the movement, Bob, of people setting grains aside altogether?
I think that is a fad, and I think that it's a little bit dangerous. As we talked about earlier, there's some grains that have been adulterated. We found in our research, and we've published 31 peer-reviewed journal articles now. You can go online, you can go to our website, kamut.com, and you can find them and read them for yourself. We found that modern wheat causes inflammation. When you're talking about young people getting arthritis, well, that's inflammation. Most of chronic disease is tied to inflammation. So the more inflammation you introduce into the body, the more likely you're going to start having these chronic diseases spring up, or at least aggravate them or feed them, essentially. But grains come with so many important nutrients of B vitamins and other really important secondary metabolites that are from plants that are in grains that is important for our health.
Coming up, Bob explains how wheat sensitivities may actually be a reaction to glyphosate. And he talks about his plans to discuss this with the Environmental Protection Agency because it is indeed compromising our health.
You're listening to the Wise Traditions podcast from the Weston A. Price Foundation. We pause now to recognize our sponsors.
Ancestral Supplements. Grass-fed colostrum by Ancestral Supplements. There are many ancestral records of praise given for colostrum throughout history. For thousands of years, Ayurvedic practitioners have used colostrum for its healing benefits, and in India, cows are still considered sacred animals. Hieroglyphic texts show that colostrum was used by the ancient Egyptians as well. Every mammal's birthright is to receive colostrum as our first food. Colostrum, which is mother's first milk, is the fundamental nourishment that provides all the essentials to thrive as a healthy animal in nature. It is loaded with immune and growth factors and protective proteins. It is not only essential to mammals in the wild, but it helps us to build and maintain a robust immune system and supports gut growth and repair. So visit ancestralsupplements.com to see what they can do for you. Ancestral Supplements, putting back in what the modern world has left out. And don't forget that our Wise Traditions Conference is right around the corner, November 15th to the 17th, just north of Dallas, Texas. The speaker lineup is stellar. You don't want to miss it. It's the conference that nourishes in every way. This year, there are beginner, general, and advanced tracks, making it easier to figure out what works for you. So join us. Enjoy nutritious food, learn healing wisdom, meet friends, and be inspired. Go to wisetraditions.org to sign up today. This is Holistic Hilda, and you're listening to Wise Traditions.
If you look at wheat, for example, and wheat's kind of gotten a bad rap now, and as a wheat farmer, I take quite exception to that because this is the grain that built ancient civilizations for thousands of years. The Phoenicians, the Romans, the Greeks, the Egyptians. All these people had a diet based on wheat. Was it to follow their civilization because they were eating wheat? I don't think so. And were 20% of their people unable to eat wheat without trouble? I don't think so. Right now, 20% of our population cannot eat wheat without having some kind of difficulty. So rather than throw the baby out with the bathwater, let's go back and look at the baby and see what's changed. All the dirt the baby has now, let's wash that off. Let's go back to heritage wheats. Let's go back to organic farming techniques without all these chemicals. And pesticide residues, another one, we didn't talk about that, but pesticide residues on wheat, particularly glyphosate, is mimicking what many people feel are wheat sensitivity symptoms. They're actually symptoms caused by glyphosate. Glyphosate is an antibiotic. And besides affecting plants, it disrupts a certain metabolic pathway found only in plants, not in humans, but in plants, and it causes them to die. But it also affects the same metabolic pathways in many bacteria. So it causes all bacteria to die. Well, where are bacteria located? In your soil. So we're killing our soils. The more glyphosate we're putting on, we're getting dead dirt instead of living soils, and it's just the opposite of what we need. But if you look at your gut, that harbors more bacterial cells than we have human cells in our whole body. This is huge, and this is really the lifeline, or where it begins, of the change of food into medicine. And you have to have a viable, healthy gut to do that properly and to release those compounds so that they do become medicinal for you and really support the body and your longevity and the health and strength that you have. But if you're going to kill off a good share of those by eating glyphosate-tainted foods, then you start to have all kinds of weird responses to that. And for different people, it'll be different things. It's not always the same thing for every person. They respond in different ways, but it's always in a negative way. And many times that wheat is blamed when it should be glyphosate is at the heart of the trouble.
Yeah, I think Sally said one time, people think they're gluten intolerant when they're glyphosate intolerant.
Right, and everybody's glyphosate intolerant because it's not good for us. It's a poison to some organisms. And in this case, it's a poison to many of the organisms that keep us alive and viable.
And isn't that actually why you're here today? Because you're going to talk to somebody in power about using glyphosate? Talk to us a little bit about your purpose here in D.C. this day.
Well, tomorrow we're going to meet with a bureau, a department at least, in the EPA that has control over pesticides, and glyphosate is the topic of conversation. Because of the enormous increase in the use of glyphosate, in our area, we're finding it's contaminating everywhere, contaminating the environment, not only tainting our food. We have glyphosate in our rain now that falls on our organic farm. We have glyphosate that's detectable. It's very low levels, but you don't need much of this stuff to cause trouble. It's not enough to kill the plants, but it's enough to taint some of our crops so it can be detected. And this, to me, is just unconscionable. We cannot keep going in this direction. We don't need these things. We farmed without them. They're convenient and they make food cheaper. That's true, but they make it also less healthy, less nutritious. And worse than that, it actually is causing disease. And so how much do we want to trade off for a little convenience at the farm gate and being able to offer wheat cheaper? I mean, it's so cheap now, farmers can't even make a living growing it because the price that they get at the elevator doesn't even cover all the cost of the chemicals that they put on it, plus all the other expenses that they have. So it's really a race to the bottom. Hilda, it's the wrong direction to go. And so the government is always pushing great advances in technology. We're getting bigger and bigger yields all the time. We've had some yield increases certainly over the years, but we've had a huge price to pay in how it affects the health of our people.
Absolutely. I get the feeling you're a little bit passionate about this.
I certainly am. I am, because it's what I have studied now for 30 years. I mean, I didn't start out this way. I started out a chemical guy like everybody else, my neighbors, my dad, and everybody else. And I just started to see one episode at a time opening up like a new movie. And then after, converting our farm to organic, we did that in 3 years. I had 2 great successes on my first 2 years of experiments, and I was just done with chemicals because I could see that there was a better way of producing food and farming. It was not only viable agronomically, it was improving my soils and my plants. It was also viable economically. It was reversing the downward spiral that I was getting more and more into debt. Now that was being reversed because now all of a sudden my products are worth more, had a higher value, and I had reduced my expenses in growing them.
Wow, it reminds me of what Alan Savory says. It's holistic management. It's something, when you manage the land properly, it produces food that's good for the people, it's good for the economy, it's good for everybody.
It's a win-win-win.
Yeah.
So why don't we have more of it? Because too many people, I shouldn't say, they're not very many, but too large companies are making too much money with the system that we have now. So we have big pharma on the one side, and they're making gobs of money on this, everybody being sick, or the great increase in chronic disease. They're making gobs of money on this. The chemical companies, on the other hand, are making gobs of money on providing more and more inputs for farmers to buy. And once you start buying a few, then you have to keep buying more and more to keep the system going. That's why I say it's a race to the bottom. It's a never-ending cycle that we become more and more dependent. It's going backwards in time to serfdom, where the farmers still own the land by and large, at least in the West, and Montana and those kind of states we do. Only the castle is gone. We are subservient to the chemical dealers who are saying, this is what you have to farm. And there's no other choice. And the universities are saying the same thing, and the government's saying the same thing. This is technology, this is advancement, this is the way to feed the world. All those are lies. And, and some of the people that are saying them don't realize that they're lies. But if they would study it, they'd see the fallacies of them.
Well, I'm so glad you're bucking the system and you're representing people who really want something to change here for the betterment of all of us. So now I'm going to ask you 2 final questions as we start to wrap up. One is, I know it's not a competition, but how come everyone's heard of einkorn and no one's heard of kamut?
Oh, well, we just started 30 years ago. Kamut it's a trademark. Our family owns this trademark, but we don't own the grain. The grain is a gift from our Creator, from our God, who provided what we needed on the earth in the beginning for all the things that we need to be healthy and strong, including our food. And the trademark guarantees to the customers that it's organically grown, that it's always 100% ancient wheat, that it has other characteristics that they can depend on. And so it's a recent trademark, no more than a little over 30 years. Einkorn is an ancient grain that I went back to Egypt to skip back to that story, and I thought, oh man, I go see for myself if this grain that we're using, we're selling as kamut, came out of the tombs. And so I went to Egypt and I went to the museums, looked in the exhibits of the tombs and what came out, and finally found the wheat. And guess what? It wasn't ours. It was einkorn. Oh. They were growing einkorn in ancient Egypt. And this is also a traditional grain. So I was kind of deflated about that because we'd been telling this story for 5 or 10 years. And then I went to Turkey, and in Turkey they told me, they said, oh, well, we know this grain. We call it camel's tooth because the way it's shaped is kind of big on one end, small on the other. It has a hump in it like a tooth might have, or tooth root. Or they said we call it the prophet's wheat. I said, oh, that's so interesting. Why do you call it the prophet's wheat? I said it had something to do with Muhammad because it's pretty Muslim there. And I thought, well, okay, it's part of their tradition. Oh, no, he says, not that prophet. He says, the one with the boat. And I said, the boat? I said, you mean Noah? Oh, yes, he said. This is the grain Noah brought with him on the ark. And I thought, wow, that's a lot better story than my old tomb story. So anyway, those are the legends of these people in the Mesopotamia. This is where the grain originated. And so we don't know if that's true or not, until we find the ark and a few kernels in the cracks of the wood or something. And can verify it. But they have this legend that goes down that they've saved this grain and cultivated it and cared for it. And it's unchanged over those many, many centuries. And so whatever the value it had in the beginning, it still has today. And that's the beauty of it. The common name is Khorasan, and it's not commercialized anywhere that we know of in the world before we started. Einkorn was more well-known and widespread in certain circles, and it was cultivated and commercialized over the centuries, and so people recognize and know the name of it. And that's why it spells the same way, and emmer, which is sometimes called farro, that's the same way. This Coruscant wheat is a little bit of a newcomer back to the market because it has some challenges agronomically in growing. We can only grow it successfully in the northern Great Plains, where we have no water, no rain about 6 weeks before harvest. Otherwise, it came out of the deserts. It has no resistance to diseases that come with high humidity and rainfall during the harvest time. And so we can't grow it east of Bismarck or into the winter wheat belt of North America. So it's a fairly small region of Montana, Alberta, Saskatchewan, western North Dakota that's successfully grown. So it's a little bit more isolated, and the area where it's produced is more restricted.
Needs a little more TLC, it sounds like, than some of the other ancient grains. So I want to wrap up by asking you the question I often ask at the end of the show. If the listener could do one thing, Bob, one thing to improve their health, because a lot of people listening are just trying to get better, get healthier, what would you recommend that they do?
I'd have a hard time taking it down to one. First of all, eat organic, because that's closer to natural systems the way it was intended to be. I would eat from heirloom crops, and I would minimally process. I would not throw away any of the nutrition in any of your food, any more than you can. I mean, you might want to peel a carrot or something, okay, if it's not easily to wash up all the dirt. But don't process your food to death. So do organic, do ancient or heritage products, and same with animals. I mean, chickens and everything. Don't get the ones that have been highly changed, and then minimally process them.
Wow, that's great advice. And you are living proof that this works, because you just look so hale and hearty. You guys, Bob is on this huge book tour, and he's going to be at our conference this November. So we will connect with you again. And thank you for your time, Bob.
Thanks so much. It's been great to be with you.
Our guest today was Bob Quinn. Visit his website, bobquinnorganicfarmer.com, and come hear him speak and meet him in person at the conference in Dallas this November. You can find me on Instagram at Holistic Hilda and on my new Holistic Hilda YouTube channel. For the show notes for this and every podcast episode, go to our website, westinaprice.org, and click on the podcast page. And that's it. So thanks for listening, everybody, and see you soon.
Wise Traditions is a project of the Weston A. Price Foundation for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. The content on this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended to substitute for the advice provided by your doctor or other healthcare professional. It is not intended to be, nor does it constitute healthcare or medical advice. On behalf of the Weston A. Price Foundation, thanks for listening. We have many free resources to support you on your health journey. Visit westonaprice.org to find podcasts, articles, videos, and more. You can also find a local chapter near you for help in finding sources of great food. We invite you to support the Foundation's mission of education, research, and activism by becoming a member. Thanks again, and take care.